The archival footage rolls. The Secretary of Defense leans into the microphone. Then the audio cuts to dead silence right as he utters the phrase, $2.3 trillion. Let that number crystallize in your mind. If you stacked $2.3 trillion in $100 bills, that column of paper would stretch over 68 miles into the stratosphere. It would completely dwarf the Washington Monument, piercing the very edge of space. This is not a rounding error. Every April, you calculate your taxes down to the exact cent. You file your returns under the explicit threat of federal penalty, asset seizure, or even prison. Yet, the largest military apparatus in human history operates on a gentleman's agreement with your money. Your ignorance of this massive discrepancy is the ultimate hidden tax on your daily labor. You are waking up, going to work, and unknowingly financing a bureaucratic black hole that answers to no one. We're going to strip away the noise. Forget the basement conspiracies and internet rumors. I'm going to walk you through a master class in modern forensic accounting and open source intelligence. We will pull apart the primary ledgers, the archaic mainframe architectures, and the systemic legal loopholes. We are hunting for the structural mechanism that allows wealth equal to the gross domestic product of a major industrialized nation to simply evaporate from the public paper trail. The date is September 10th, 2001. We are inside a sterile fluorescent-lit briefing room in the E-ring of the Pentagon. Donald Rumsfeld stands before the press corps, delivering a dry, bureaucratic update. But to a forensic investigator, the words he speaks are a financial detonation. He is formally declaring a crime scene, admitting that the central nervous system of the American military cannot balance its own checkbook. To understand the anatomy of this failure, you have to track a single digital dollar. Watch it move from the United States Treasury, pulsing through the encrypted fiber optic cables, until it hits the server rooms of the Defense Finance and Accounting Service. And there, on rows of glowing green screen monitors, the transaction simply shatters. The dollar breaks into thousands of untraceable data fragments, vanishing into a maze of incompatible protocols and dead-end subdirectories. This is the exact anomaly that brought the secretary to the podium. On record, he stated that according to internal estimates, the department simply cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions. In the clinical language of auditing, cannot track means the chain of custody is broken. The money left the vault, but the receipts, the invoices, and the vendor's signatures are mathematically severed from the original payment orders. You have to understand the sheer gravity of that missing ledger. In the year 2001, $2.3 trillion was equivalent to roughly 25% of the entire United States federal budget. A quarter of the nation's sovereign wealth, designated for defense, was flowing through a system with no verifiable exit point. It is a volume of capital so massive, it distorts the economic gravity around it. When a quarter of a federal budget goes dark, it ceases to be a mere accounting glitch. It becomes a financial ghost state operating quietly within the borders of the legitimate government. As an investigator, when I see a discrepancy of this magnitude, I do not look for a thief with a duffel bag. I look for an institutional architecture designed to obfuscate. You do not misplace that kind of wealth by accident. You hide it through systematic, engineered friction. The fundamental rule of financial forensics is that every dollar leaves a shadow. Even if you delete a database, the transaction creates ripples in contractor dividends, offshore accounts, and supply chain logistics. But inside the Pentagon's network, those shadows are deliberately erased. The standard forensic tools we use to dismantle cartel laundering operations or track corporate embezzlement completely fail when applied to the Department of Defense. We are looking at a system built to resist investigation. The evidence does not point to a sudden heist, but rather a slow, methodical bleed spanning decades. Year after year, the financial statements were rubber-stamped, the discrepancies were ignored, and the black hole grew wider. The auditors who tried to raise the alarm were met with locked filing cabinets and highly classified clearance walls. The system protected itself by compartmentalizing the evidence. Any seasoned prosecutor will tell you that a confession is only the beginning of a case. The Secretary of Defense stood in front of the world and offered a confession of systemic failure. The very next logical step should have been an unprecedented mobilization of federal auditors. The Treasury should have frozen assets. Congressional subcommittees should have immediately subpoenaed every regional commander and resource manager. But the timing of this public admission guaranteed that the investigation would never launch. The press conference took place on a Monday morning. The news cycle barely had time to process the magnitude of the missing trillions. Reporters were just beginning to draft their headlines, and financial watchdogs were just starting to file their Freedom of Information requests. They had less than 24 hours to act. The very next morning, the events of September 11th unfolded. The world changed forever in a matter of hours. The horrific destruction completely wiped the financial discrepancy from the global news cycle. The missing $2.3 trillion was instantly buried under the rubble, the grief, and the immediate pivot toward a global military response. The ledgers were forgotten before the ink was even dry on the morning papers. In the chaos of the following weeks, the investigation into the missing funds was entirely abandoned. The very concept of financial oversight became secondary to national security. But the math did not change. The broken mainframes remained broken. The untraceable transactions continued to flow, accelerated by the massive influx of emergency wartime funding. The black hole was not closed. It was merely given a permanent operational cover. But step back and look at the sequence of events. The crime scene was entirely public. The primary suspect admitted to the missing money on live national television, broadcast to millions. Yet, why was there no immediate panic in the financial markets that afternoon? Why did the defense contractors remain silent? We have to ask ourselves, was this admission a plea for help, or was it a calculated declaration of absolute immunity? The absence of panic on the trading floors that Monday afternoon was not an oversight. It was an institutional understanding of the architecture. The moment that single digital dollar passed from the Treasury into the server rooms of the Defense Finance and Accounting Service, it did not vanish into thin air. It hit a digital brick wall. To follow the money, I have to trace a transaction that shatters upon impact, fracturing into thousands of isolated data points across a blind network. To the forensic accountant operating in a 68-degree secure facility, the paper trail is a hostile environment. Staring at an archaic monitor blinking green in the dim light, they are navigating the digital equivalent of an archaeological dig. This is a dive into legacy mainframe computers built in the 1970s. We are looking at tangled virtual wires, a labyrinth representing isolated, fundamentally incompatible databases running the most lethal organization on the planet. The anomaly here is mechanical. How do you actually lose $2.3 trillion? You do not lose it in a duffel bag, and you do not accidentally misplace it in a spreadsheet. You store it in a system that speaks a dead language. The auditor types a basic query into the terminal, only to watch the system reject the protocol entirely. The evidence is locked behind a syntax error. buried in code that modern financial software cannot even comprehend or legally verify. The investigation reveals a structural nightmare. In 2001, the Department of Defense did not use a centralized ledger. Instead, they operated over 2,200 distinct accounting systems simultaneously. This is an empire where every outpost speaks a different dialect, yet they must trade seamlessly. These thousands of isolated mainframes were fundamentally incapable of communicating with each other, creating a vast archipelago of disconnected financial islands. This extreme fragmentation is the perfect alibi. When you pull a transaction record from a logistics command in Europe, the data simply cannot be reconciled with a procurement database in Virginia. The systems require manual translation at every single node. The forensic accountant watches the data stream hit a translation bottleneck and die. We are not looking at a modern financial institution. You are looking at a bureaucratic Frankenstein held together by analog duct tape and blind faith. The fatal flaw in the architecture becomes obvious when funds cross departmental lines. Forensic analysis reveals that when money transferred between the Army and the Navy, the receiving systems could not read the formats. To prevent the logistics supply chain from halting, clerks were forced to manually bypass the errors. They entered what are known as unsupported journal vouchers. This is a polite accounting term for fabricating a number just to force the master ledger to balance. To an auditor, an unsupported journal voucher is the equivalent of a tampered crime scene. There is no invoice, no receipt, and no verifiable paper trail. The clerk simply types a multi-million-dollar plug entry into the terminal to satisfy the software's demand for equilibrium. It is mathematical fiction written into the official record. The system accepts the fake number, the green cursor blinks, and the actual origin of the funds is permanently severed from its ultimate destination. Now multiply that single fabricated entry by millions of daily transactions over decades. The database is heavily saturated with synthetic data. The investigator staring at the printouts realizes that the official ledger is a hallucination. You are not tracking reality. You are tracking a completely separate, internally consistent mathematical simulation. The $2.3 trillion discrepancy was simply the cumulative sum of all these phantom journal entries hiding in the code. I have to be precise about the terminology. In the rigid protocol of financial forensics, the term untracked does not necessarily mean stolen. When a paper trail is severed, the asset is simply compromised. The physical cash did not disappear into a vacuum. The money was undeniably dispersed to private contractors, weapons manufacturers, and suppliers. But the critical receipts proving those deliveries were mathematically decoupled from the original payment orders within the mainframe. The beneficiary of the offshore account or the defense contractor received their wire transfer perfectly on time. The transaction cleared the banking sector without triggering a single alarm. But inside the Pentagon's archaic architecture, the specific motive for the payment was erased. The investigator holds a receipt for $1 billion, but the system cannot identify if that money bought experimental body armor, guided munitions, or simply lined the pockets of a phantom subcontractor. Any private corporation operating with this level of systemic failure would be immediately dismantled by federal regulators, its executives facing prison time for massive fraud. Yet, this architecture remained completely immune to standard oversight. The forensic accountant understands the bitter truth. Nobody upgrades the servers because the blind spots are highly functional. The inability to reconcile the data provides plausible deniability for every questionable contract ever signed. The paper trail was cold, but it was not completely dead. In the late summer of 2001, specialized teams of civilian auditors were actively descending into this digital catacomb. They were printing the master logs, manually matching the unsupported vouchers, and aggressively attempting to reconstruct the severed connections between the 2,200 isolated databases. They were closing in on the specific beneficiaries of the missing $2.3 trillion. Those critical manual reconstructions, the only physical evidence capable of decoding the black hole, were not stored on a redundant cloud server. They existed as thousands of pages of hard copy printouts and primary backup tapes. All of this forensic evidence was meticulously gathered and locked inside filing cabinets within a very specific geographic location. They were housed in the newly renovated section of the military complex known as Wedge One, waiting for the morning of September 11th. Those filing cabinets waiting in Wedge One held the only physical key to the digital labyrinth I just detailed. The civilian teams had manually cross-referenced thousands of unsupported vouchers, slowly bridging the gap between those isolated mainframes. They were doing the slow, agonizing work of turning phantom data into a concrete paper trail. But a digital anomaly requires physical evidence to prosecute, and that vital evidence was centralized in the single, highly vulnerable location. Observe the three-dimensional architectural wireframe of the Pentagon on the morning of September 11th. A sharp red vector tracks straight into the newly renovated outer ring, specifically targeting a sector designated as Wedge One. To the Defense Inspector General Auditor, this is not just an impact zone. It is the epicenter of a massive financial investigation. A detective requires a pristine crime scene to build a case. But what happens when that crime scene is physically annihilated? The trajectory of American Airlines Flight 77 did not just strike a random administrative wing of the massive military complex. The impact zone perfectly intersected with the exact offices housing the most intensive efforts to track the missing $2.3 trillion. The aircraft penetrated the reinforced concrete of Wedge One, tearing directly through the Naval Command Center and the specific corridors dedicated to the Resource Services Washington Division. From the perspective of the defense auditor reviewing the aftermath, the statistical probability of this precision strike is a glaring anomaly. The Pentagon is the largest low-rise office building in the world, boasting over 6 million square feet of floor space. Yet, the destruction was highly localized, right over the central nervous system of the Financial Reconciliation Project. The sheer kinetic force of the impact instantly vaporized the very perimeter of the active audit. The human cost within those specific offices was catastrophic and highly targeted by the nature of the impact. The strike decimated the ranks of the Resource Services Washington Division. 34 of the 65 Army Resource Management personnel present that morning were killed instantly. These were the civilian accountants, the budget analysts, and the specialized clerks who possessed the unique institutional knowledge required to navigate the archaic 1970s software. The loss of these specific individuals created an immediate intellectual vacuum. You cannot simply hire new graduates to replace them. These analysts spent years learning the esoteric quirks of the military-industrial ledger. They were the human translators for the incompatible databases. When the ceiling collapsed in Wedge One, the Defense Department did not just lose dedicated employees, it permanently lost the internal map required to navigate its own broken financial architecture. But the structural damage extended far beyond the loss of human capital. Crucial physical servers and master backup tapes were housed directly inside the blast radius. The resulting fire burned at over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, a thermal threshold that easily melts steel and instantly reduces digital storage to toxic slag. Thousands of pages of paper records, the very documents tracking those unsupported journal vouchers, drifted through the air as unrecognizable white ash. To the auditor sifting through the wreckage days later, the reality is stark and uncompromising. The primary evidence required to reconstruct the severed payment orders has been permanently erased. You cannot subpoena ashes. You cannot extract data from a server rack that has been subjected to temperatures of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The physical destruction achieved what the digital fragmentation started: an absolute and impenetrable forensic dead end for the missing trillions. I must emphasize that this localized destruction sealed the black box forever. The off-site backups for these legacy systems were either non-existent or tragically incomplete, a direct consequence of the disjointed architecture we analyzed previously. The investigators were left with fragmented digital ghosts, but the hard proof, the signed contracts, the physical receipts, was incinerated. The paper trail did not just go cold. It was turned to carbon before your very eyes. In any standard criminal investigation, the catastrophic destruction of the primary archive on the eve of an audit would immediately trigger suspicions of arson and cover-ups. The timing is a glaring red flag in the forensic protocol. However, the sheer scale of the national tragedy completely overshadowed the financial destruction. The investigators forced to close the file, not because the anomaly was resolved, but because the foundational documents no longer exist in the physical universe. What remained in the E-ring of the Pentagon was a profound, defensive silence. The surviving audit teams were immediately stonewalled by the sheer chaos of the recovery effort. Any locked filing cabinets that survived the fire's periphery were sealed under new security classifications. The bureaucratic friction, always present in the defense sector, suddenly became an impenetrable wall of national security protocol. The financial discrepancy was effectively buried under the heavy rubble. With the physical records destroyed and the core analytical team decimated, the financial investigation was completely paralyzed. There was no longer a functional oversight mechanism capable of tracking the military-industrial complex's massive cash flow. The ledger was entirely blind. And this absolute lack of visibility occurred at the precise historical moment when the United States government was about to open the largest spigot of defense funding in the history of human warfare. The crime scene was sterilized by fire, and the original mystery of the missing money was locked away in a vault of collective trauma. But the accounting engine did not stop. It merely shifted gears. I know that when oversight dies, unregulated capital thrives. The destruction of Wedge One was not the end of the financial black hole. It was the violent reset button that allowed an entirely new, exponentially larger influx of untraceable capital to begin flowing the very next morning. The destruction of Wedge One was not the end of the financial black hole. It was the violent reset button that allowed an entirely new, exponentially larger influx of untraceable capital to begin flowing the very next morning. I watched the congressional authorization for the global war on terror clear the floor, and I see the ultimate forensic nightmare unfolding in real time. The ashes of the old ledger were still smoldering when the Treasury doors swung wide open. Under the cover of night, on the tarmac of an undisclosed airbase, the abstract digits of the defense budget take physical form. Forklifts load pallets stacked high with shrink-wrapped $100 bills into the cavernous holds of C-130 Hercules transport planes. The logistics of modern warfare require liquid capital. But, as an investigator, I look at those cargo planes and see a flying statistical anomaly. A one-way trip off the financial grid. The entire oversight mechanism was legally and physically paralyzed. Which brings us to a terrifying mathematical paradox, the core anomaly of this new era. If your internal systems are already shattered, if you already cannot track $2.3 trillion of your own money, what happens when a terrified nation suddenly hands you a blank check? You do not get accountability. You get an accelerant thrown onto a systemic fire. In the immediate aftermath of the September attacks, the overarching priority of the United States government shifted violently. Financial reconciliation, the painstaking process of matching a receipt to a payment order, was abandoned entirely in favor of rapid military deployment. The protocol was simple: get the assets downrange and worry about the paperwork a decade later. It is a perfect recipe for absolute institutional amnesia. Congress authorized a staggering surge in the Department of Defense budget. We are tracking hundreds of billions of dollars newly injected into the system. But remember the baseline we established earlier. This capital was being poured directly into 2,200 legacy mainframes that were fundamentally broken. The Pentagon was pumping high-pressure financial fuel through shattered, disconnected pipes. From an auditing perspective, this is not just negligence. It is the deliberate manufacturing of chaos. When you increase the volume of transactions in a system incapable of cross-communication, you do not just lose track of the money, you actively destroy the forensic trail. The sheer velocity of the capital flow creates a smokescreen, allowing contractors to draw massive funds without providing a verifiable chain of custody. We must follow the paper trail to its absolute limits, right to the highly secure loading docks of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. In the early phases of the Iraq reconstruction, the standard electronic transfer systems were deemed too slow or entirely unworkable for a war zone. The solution was brute force economics. The central bank literally boxed up the American taxpayers' labor and shipped it out as volatile cargo. The physical scale of this transaction defies standard economic logic. The Treasury dispersed $12 billion in hard physical cash. This was not a highly monitored wire transfer. We are analyzing hundreds of tons of printed currency, bundled tightly in plastic, loaded onto military transport flights destined for Baghdad. It remains the largest single transfer of physical cash in the recorded history of global finance. Once those C-130 transport planes lift off the tarmac, the money exits the closed loop of the American banking system. It enters a combat zone devoid of basic banking infrastructure, let alone independent oversight. As an investigator, my stomach drops. I know that physical cash leaves no digital footprint. The exact moment the shrink wrap is cut open in a desert compound, the asset is effectively and permanently anonymized. The predictable failure of this shadow economy was documented thoroughly years later. The Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction, an entity explicitly created to audit this chaos, opened the ledgers and found a terrifying void. Their final reports confirmed the mathematical certainty of the crisis. Billions of dollars of this physical cash simply vanished. It could not be properly accounted for by any verifiable metric. Think about the pure logistics of losing $1 billion in physical currency. It requires hundreds of pallets. It requires cargo trucks, coordinated schedules, and a vast network of complicit actors. It does not just slip between the couch cushions. The Special Inspector General's report is essentially a formal declaration of surrender. The paper trail ends at the Baghdad airport, and the beneficiaries disappear into the fog of war. We are looking at a system operating exactly as it was incentivized to operate. The global crisis provided the ultimate alibi. If a persistent auditor asks where the hundreds of tons of cash went, the defense bureaucracy simply points to the urgency of the conflict. National security becomes the impenetrable shield against basic financial transparency. The black hole we observed in the year 2001 was merely the prototype. We are uncovering a financial architecture designed to evade the very citizens who fund it. If this scale of institutional opacity blows your mind too, hit the like button. To ensure you do not miss the solution to this forensic mystery, subscribe right now. Do you think any standard accounting firm stood a chance against this geopolitical machine? Let me know your read in the comments, because we need every investigator on this case. The missing $12 billion in physical cash is just the visible surface of a much deeper systemic rot. The real crime is not the theft of paper bills in a chaotic war zone. The real crime is the legal and structural framework that authorized the blind flight in the first place. We are documenting the exact moment when the military-industrial complex realized that untrackable spending carries absolutely zero bureaucratic consequences. The cash flights to Baghdad were a temporary brute force solution to a logistical problem. But back in Washington, the defense accountants were developing a much more elegant, digitized method for hiding the money. They realized you do not need a C-130 Hercules to make billions of dollars disappear. You just need a keyboard, an outdated mainframe, and the legal authority to rewrite reality. The era of the shadow ledger had officially begun. The era of the shadow ledger did not require a sophisticated conspiracy. It only required time and an archaic interface. We tracked the chaotic spending of the war years, waiting a decade for the digital dust to settle. Look at the split screen of our modern financial reality. On the left, Wall Street high-frequency trading algorithms execute millions of microtransactions per second, a flawless mathematical ballet. On the right, a Department of Defense clerk sits in a fluorescent-lit cubicle, manually typing a multi-billion-dollar entry into an outdated terminal to close a fiscal quarter. To the forensic accountant sitting in a 68-degree windowless secure facility in Northern Virginia, this split screen is the ultimate crime scene. The desk is buried under redacted ledger printouts, but the digital fingerprints are clear. The initial assumption was that the $2.3 trillion announced in 2001 was an isolated catastrophe, a one-time glitch in the matrix. But the paper trail from the subsequent decade tells a much darker story. The black hole did not close after the physical destruction of the evidence. It expanded, feeding on the unchecked appropriations of the post-9/11 military buildup. In forensic accounting, you look for the anomaly that breaks the foundational rules of mathematics. A ledger is a scale. Debits must equal credits. If a transaction is missing a counterweight, the system should crash. Yet, the Pentagon's master ledger remained perfectly balanced on paper, year after year. The math did not add up, but the official reports presented a pristine, mathematically impossible equilibrium. To understand how a broken machine outputs a perfect report, I pulled the archives from a decade later. We isolated the transactions from the United States Army. The motive was simple: follow the largest appropriations. The evidence uncovered was not a subtle accounting error or a misplaced decimal point. It was a structural fabrication so massive it eclipsed the entire gross domestic product of most modern nations. By the year 2015, a formal investigation revealed a devastating truth about the military's financial protocols. The Army alone had made $6.5 trillion in wrongful adjustments to its accounting entries. Let that number sink in. $6.5 trillion. They manipulated the data exclusively to make the fragmented ledgers appear mathematically balanced for congressional review.
This is the corpse we are examining. $6.5 trillion in unsupported, completely fictional alterations to the official record. This is not a rounding error committed by a fatigued clerk. This is a systematic, institutionalized process of rewriting financial reality. When the outdated COBOL mainframes failed to reconcile the legitimate receipts, the system simply generated phantom transactions to fill the void. Every illicit operation has its own internal vocabulary, a language designed to sanitize the crime. In the world of corporate fraud, this might be called cooking the books. But inside the E-ring of the Pentagon, these multi-billion-dollar fabrications have a specific, almost harmless-sounding technical designation. The forensic accountant highlights this recurring term across thousands of pages of redacted printouts. These adjustments are known in forensic accounting as plugs. They are fabricated numbers inserted into the master ledger specifically to mask discrepancies that investigators cannot resolve. When the paper trail goes cold, when the beneficiary of a wire transfer cannot be identified, the clerk simply types a plug. It is the bureaucratic equivalent of sweeping dirt under a rug, but executed on a macroeconomic scale. Look back at the right side of that split screen. That isolated clerk typing into the green glow of an obsolete terminal is not processing a legitimate invoice for weapons or salaries. They're typing a plug. They're manually forcing the budget to balance by entering a ghost number. Each keystroke buries the evidence of a failed transaction deeper into an encrypted archive that no civilian auditor will ever access. The immediate question for any investigator is chain of command. Who authorizes a junior clerk to fabricate a $10 billion plug to close out a fiscal year? You follow the protocol upwards. The trail leads directly to the Defense Finance and Accounting Service, the central nervous system of military expenditure. This is the agency explicitly responsible for paying the military and tracking the disbursements. The most chilling discovery is not the existence of the plugs, but their official status. The Defense Finance and Accounting Service treats these massive plug entries as standard operating procedure. It is not a secret, clandestine activity conducted in the shadows. It is the officially sanctioned method for dealing with a financial architecture that is fundamentally incapable of performing basic arithmetic. This protocol demonstrates that the entire defense financial architecture relies on fictional data to function. The official ledger is an illusion. When you look at the annual reports submitted to the Treasury, you are not reading a historical record of actual expenditures. You are reading a carefully curated work of fiction, stitched together by trillions of dollars in fabricated plugs, just to keep the machine running. As a forensic investigator, you realize the trap. You cannot audit a system that legally permits itself to invent numbers whenever the math fails. The plugs destroy the very concept of a financial alibi. If every discrepancy can be erased with a keystroke, then true oversight is a mathematical impossibility. The system is perfectly insulated from scrutiny because the evidence is constantly being overwritten by ghosts. The realization hits hard in that 68-degree room. We are not hunting for stolen cash. We are analyzing a machine that generates amnesia. The $6.5 trillion in false entries from 2015 was just the warm-up act. The real test was approaching.
The moment when the federal government would finally attempt to breach this fortress of fictional data and demand a true accounting. The federal government finally demanded a true accounting, attempting to put an end to the era of $6.5 trillion fictional plugs. The congressional mandate was absolute. Breach the fortress of synthetic data and map every single cent of military expenditure. No more ghost ledgers. No more mathematical illusions. The era of the unchecked military-industrial complex was supposedly over. Enter the modern day. An army of independent auditors in sharp suits marches into the Pentagon. Through the eyes of a Defense Inspector General auditor, the battlefield is set. They carry heavy briefcases into the fluorescent-lit cubicles of the E-ring. Brand new laptops boot up, ready to dissect the financial nervous system of the most heavily funded organization on the planet. The anomaly is staggering in its simplicity. What exactly happens when the most powerful government on Earth finally decides to audit itself? You would expect a seamless digital handshake, a transparent flow of transactional data confirming the integrity of the Republic. Instead, you find a deliberate labyrinth designed to bleed the investigator dry, burying the truth under endless protocols. It took 3 decades of continuous legal pressure to force this confrontation. In 2018, 30 years after a federal law explicitly required all government agencies to produce verifiable financial statements, the Department of Defense finally underwent its first agency-wide test. The ultimate black box of American power was scheduled to be cracked open for the public. This was not a localized spot check or a limited congressional inquiry. It was the first comprehensive financial audit in the history of the department. They deployed over 1,200 independent auditors, a massive financial strike force tasked with tracking down the receipts for a global military footprint. The scale of the investigation was entirely unprecedented. But the investigator quickly hits a digital brick wall. The auditor plugs in their modern hardware, expecting to parse clean databases. Instead, the screen flickers and fills with red "access denied" notifications. They are surrounded by locked filing cabinets containing obsolete software manuals. The legacy systems actively reject the modern interrogation protocols at every single terminal. The exhaustion sets in during the double shifts. The auditor realizes that the Pentagon's financial architecture is not merely disorganized. It is a hostile environment. It is a system heavily armored by bureaucratic friction and systemic stonewalling. Every request for a transaction history is met with a maze of fragmented data and classified dead ends, stalling the inquiry. After months of grinding through the unyielding machinery, the verdict was delivered. The Pentagon failed the audit. It was an absolute systemic collapse across multiple agencies within the department. The massive financial strike force of private sector experts hit a wall of synthetic data and untrackable transfers. The ledgers simply could not be reconciled with objective reality. The irony of this failure is measured in the collateral damage to the taxpayer. It cost the American public over $900 million simply to conduct this initial audit. Almost $1 billion was spent paying top-tier accounting firms just to legally confirm what the internal watchdogs already suspected. The military's sprawling assets could not be mathematically verified. Let that sink in for a moment. $900 million is enough to fund the infrastructure of a small city, and it was entirely consumed by the friction of investigating a broken ledger. It stands as the most expensive admission of mathematical defeat in modern governmental history. The investigators bought nothing but the expensive confirmation of their own absolute blindness. When the digital trail evaporates, a forensic accountant must pivot to physical reality. If the software refuses to balance the cash, the investigator must go out into the field and count the physical objects bought with that cash. The independent auditors began a global inventory check, attempting to match the stated defense budget against the actual tanks, bases, and heavy munitions. The results of the physical inventory shattered the last illusion of control. During this 2018 audit, the department could not account for over 60% of its $3.1 trillion in reported physical assets. The gap between the official paperwork and the tangible reality on the ground was wide enough to swallow the gross domestic product of entire nations. The scale of the physical discrepancy is difficult to conceptualize. Entire warehouses of specialized military equipment, vehicle fleets, and sprawling real estate properties effectively did not exist on paper. Conversely, the ledgers claimed ownership of multi-million-dollar assets that the auditors simply could not locate in the real world. The physical trail was as corrupted as the digital one. Sitting in that windowless E-ring office, rubbing exhausted eyes over an impossible ledger, the auditor understands the true nature of the beast. The $900 million failure proves that oversight is mathematically futile. The system is perfectly insulated by its own immense orchestrated chaos. The Department of Defense has rendered itself legally and structurally bulletproof. The most extensive financial investigation in history proved that the books are closed to the public forever. But a failure to audit is not the end of the money's journey. It is merely the point where the capital leaves the visible spectrum. If these trillions are not sitting in ordinary warehouses or standard ledgers, they must be flowing into a parallel architecture designed to remain permanently dark. The capital leaves the visible spectrum, bleeding off the public ledger into a parallel architecture. Through the eyes of the forensic accountant, the $900 million audit failure is not a testament to bureaucratic incompetence. It is an alibi. When a financial anomaly of this magnitude refuses to be solved, you have to stop looking for a glitch and start looking for a motive. Why design a paper trail that leads nowhere? Look at the high-resolution satellite feed of a classified aerospace testing facility in the Nevada desert. The optical sensors pick up the intense heat signatures of experimental aircraft bleeding off the tarmac. But the real anomaly is not in the thermals, it is in the transaction logs. We're tracking a wire transfer from an anonymous shell company, routed directly into the logistics grid of this heavily guarded installation. The transaction is mathematically flawless, yet legally invisible. It defies every standard protocol of federal oversight. If the missing trillions were simply stolen, the market would feel the inflationary impact of that capital. But the money is not being spent on luxury yachts or offshore estates. If it is not being embezzled, where is this immense wealth actually going? The answer, quite literally, lies in the shadows. The forensic accountant follows the routing numbers away from the general military budget and into the domain of special access programs. In the intelligence community, these are universally known as black budgets. A massive, quantifiable portion of the untraceable funds flows directly into these classified operations. We are talking about the financial lifeblood for everything from advanced stealth technology to covert global intelligence gathering. You have to understand the sheer volume of capital required to sustain a dark project. Developing next-generation hypersonic glide vehicles or quantum decryption algorithms cannot be financed with petty cash. These operations demand billions of dollars, continuous funding streams that must remain entirely off the books. If a program does not officially exist, its beneficiaries and its bank accounts cannot exist on a public ledger.
This brings us to the core motive for the Department of Defense's fundamentally broken accounting system. To protect these programs from foreign intelligence agencies actively analyzing public federal budgets, the Pentagon intentionally obfuscates its line items. They launder their own money. Funds are routed through secondary agencies, obscure research grants, and classified contracts, creating a deliberate forensic dead end that no auditor can legally cross. When an adversarial nation wants to know what weapons you are building, they do not just send spies. They send macroeconomists. If the United States published a perfectly transparent ledger, hostile analysts could easily calculate the exact scope and progress of top-secret weapons platforms simply by tracking the supply chain expenditures and contractor payouts. The broken database is not an accident. It is a counterintelligence protocol. The forensic accountant staring at the Nevada satellite feed realizes that the sheer chaos of the Pentagon's financial records is a feature of national security. The un-auditability is an intentional smokescreen. If the numbers never balance, the enemy can never isolate the true cost of the black budget hidden within the noise of the massive military-industrial complex. This legal shield effectively weaponizes accounting. By purposely keeping the main ledger fundamentally broken, the architects of this system have guaranteed that it is mathematically impossible for an adversary to determine the true scope of American military research and development. But this impenetrable defense mechanism does not differentiate between a foreign intelligence operative and a domestic, congressionally mandated auditor. Both are locked out by the exact same cryptographic firewall of fabricated data and unsupported journal vouchers. The system treats your demand for financial transparency as a hostile breach. The moment the defense apparatus decided that operational security was more important than democratic oversight, the ledgers were permanently severed from reality. The dark money network became the true backbone of the American defense posture. It is a cynical, brilliant design. If every dollar were perfectly tracked, the strategic element of surprise would be completely compromised. The forensic accountant understands the bitter truth of this transaction architecture. You cannot maintain global military supremacy while simultaneously opening your checkbook for public review. The shadow ledger is the exact price exacted for the continuation of total spectrum dominance. The heat signatures on the tarmac in the Nevada desert fade as the experimental aircraft is towed into a subterranean hangar. The wire transfer completes, the digital paper trail evaporates into a classified server, and the money officially ceases to exist. We have tracked the ghost money to its final destination, only to find that the very laws of accounting have been rewritten to protect the secrets it buys. The crime scene is pristine. The suspects are fully shielded by the highest levels of federal classification. You are left staring at a void that consumes trillions of dollars, a void that was engineered by the brightest minds in government finance. The investigation proves that the missing money is not a symptom of a dying bureaucracy. It is the undeniable proof of a perfectly functioning, highly classified machine operating just beneath the surface. The investigation proves the machine operates perfectly just beneath the surface. But to see the true scale of this architecture, you must zoom out from that subterranean hangar in Nevada. We leave the localized crime scenes and pull back to a macro view of the global financial network. What looks like isolated glitches at the ground level suddenly reveals itself as a highly coordinated grid. The trail of evidence leads directly to the core of Washington. We are looking at an impenetrable web of data streams encircling the Capitol. Defense contractor dividends, offshore accounts, and lobbying dollars flow in an endless, untraceable loop. This is not the debris of a broken bureaucracy. This is the schematic of a fortress. For a quarter of a century, the public was fed a narrative of institutional clumsiness, a convenient cover story masking the most sophisticated shadow economy ever constructed. The greatest trick the system ever pulled was convincing you that it was simply incompetent. We spent decades treating the Pentagon's accounting crisis as a punchline about overpriced hammers and misplaced receipts. But true power does not lose track of wealth equal to the gross domestic product of a major nation by accident. The missing money was never a mistake. The financial void was carefully engineered to consume the evidence. Review the narrative log from the very beginning. We started our inquiry on September 10, 2001, searching for a missing $2.3 trillion. We approached it like a standard forensic audit. We assumed we were dealing with a discrete anomaly, a quantifiable theft that could be tracked through the mainframe, recovered by the Treasury, and prosecuted in the light of day. We were looking for a glitch. Then we watched the physical evidence burn in Wedge One. We saw the chaos of the ensuing war utilized to flood a fundamentally shattered system with unverified cash. We tracked pallets of physical hundreds disappearing into conflict zones. Finally, we uncovered the $6.5 trillion in fabricated plug entries, the synthetic data inserted by clerks to forcefully balance the ledgers. The scheme was brutally exposed. The digital ledgers are completely severed from physical reality. The forensic trail went cold not because we lacked the technology to track the funds, but because the defense apparatus deployed a cryptographic firewall of unsupported journal vouchers. The undeniable verdict of modern forensic analysis is stark. The un-auditability of the Pentagon is not a bug in the code. It is a highly evolved, structural feature of the state. This financial opacity acts as a necessary, weaponized shield. It is a protective mechanism designed to insulate the military-industrial complex from both foreign intelligence gathering and domestic democratic oversight. By intentionally keeping the main ledger broken, the architects of this system ensure that no adversary and no civilian inspector general can map the true scope of American research and development. The historical numbers confirm the ongoing scheme. As of 2023, the Department of Defense has failed its sixth consecutive comprehensive audit. The internal officials managing these legacy networks project they will not even be capable of passing a clean financial review until at least 2027. The institutional failure is scheduled, budgeted, and politically protected at the highest levels. It costs the taxpayers nearly $1 billion annually just to conduct these independent reviews. A massive expenditure that yields the exact same irrefutable conclusion year after year. The assets simply cannot be verified. The audit itself has devolved into a theater of compliance, a bureaucratic ritual performed over an unyielding black box to pacify the public while the dark money continues to flow without interruption. The $2.3 trillion announced missing back in 2001 was never the final score of this operation. It was merely a diagnostic warning light on a dashboard that you are legally forbidden to read. Today, the Pentagon remains the only federal agency fundamentally incapable of balancing its books, maintaining a financial black hole that operates completely outside the boundaries of verifiable reality. You are financing this black hole with every hour of your labor. You are subjected to absolute financial transparency, taxed down to the exact cent under threat of federal prison. Meanwhile,
the largest apparatus of hard power in human history, operates on an honor system. The final report shows that your ignorance of this discrepancy is the ultimate hidden tax. You are paying for the privilege of remaining blind to the machinery of the empire.
This case remains open, and the shadow ledger continues to expand in the dark. If this investigation exposed a new perspective on the architecture of modern power, hit the subscribe button and leave your verdict in the comments. We must continue analyzing the data together. Tracing these global funds and breaking through the bureaucratic firewall requires you to stay vigilant with us as we follow the money into the next fiscal quarter. The ultimate existential chill is realizing that unchecked power does not need to hide its corruption. It simply makes the mathematics too complex for the public to follow. The system is operating exactly as designed, quietly securing total spectrum dominance at the total expense of the truth. The machine will not be audited, and the missing trillions will never be found. The final protocol is complete. Case closed.